We'll need to use CodePipeline service. Mine is visible from recently visited. In your case, you may need to search for this. So let's just hit CodePipeline. And I currently have no pipelines that are active. So let's create a new one. So let's hit create pipeline. And we can call this anything. I'm just going to call it React deployment. And most AWS service needs some type of role or permission to run. In this case, this will create one for us automatically. However, if you have an existing role, you can select it. We're going to leave as default and leave the name as is as well. So hit next. For the source provider, we want to go with GitHub version 2, and this will allow us to create a connection from CodePipeline to GitHub. I currently have no active connection, so I'm going to create one from scratch. If you already have a connection, you may be able to select the repository from here. So let's hit connect to GitHub. If you're doing this for the first time, you may be prompted with the GitHub Authentication page. And I've done this a couple times, so this will take me directly to the connection. So I'm going to give this a name, and this again can be anything. I'm just going to call it web deploy site and connect to GitHub. We will need to install an application. Now, once this app is installed in GitHub, it will allow us to either select all repository or a specific repository. For this example, we're going to create a new app and we're going to select the specific repository. So let's select install a new app. And I'm just going to go to my repository. And I've done this a couple of times, so I may need to remove the active one. Again, here I could select all repository or I select the specific one. In this case, I'll go with my specific repository and hit save. Once this is done, we should be able to just hit connect. And if this is successful, you will see your drop-down list of your repository. If you selected all repository, you'll see the list of all the repos that you have. And we're going to point this to the main branch. If you're creating a more advanced pipeline, you may want to make this more of a custom. For this example, we just want to run this pipeline when we push to the main branch. And in order to do this, we want to keep this checkbox active because this will give us create a webhook that triggers every time we merge changes to the main branch. So hit next with everything else left to default. And for a build provider, so we're going to use code build. In the early examples, we run all our commands that are listed in the package.json, right? In the code build machine, we can write those commands to be executed. We'll need to create this from scratch again. So let's hit create a project. And I'm going to call this React deployment. For the operating system, I'll go with Amazon Linux. If you're familiar with Ubuntu and know the appropriate commands for that, you can select Ubuntu as well. And for the runtime, standard. And the image, I usually go with the latest one. Anyone should work to run. Now this is very important. Again, this code build machine needs a role as well. And since we'll need to push the static files to S3 and create the CloudFront invalidation, we'll need to update this role later on to give it the necessary permission. We'll come back to this. Now those commands, we'll need to write them in what's called a build spec file. And the build spec file.yaml, this is and the build spec file is where we'll write our commands or instructions to run in the code build machine. This can be called any other name, .yml. I'm going to keep the name consistent and put build spec. We can either insert this using the editor or add the build spec file to our source repository. And that's all we'll do in this example. So let's add build spec right here. And that should be all we need to create our pipeline. So let's hit continue to code pipeline. and let's hit next. Now we're going to skip deploy provider for this simple example. If you're creating more of an advanced pipeline, this is a great option to have a deploy provider where you can choose to use S3 or code deploy. So let's hit skip deploy stage. And we should see a list of all the commands or stages that our pipeline has. So let's hit create pipeline. Now, upon creating our pipeline, it will run automatically the first time and should fail since we haven't added the build spec file yet. And after a few minutes, this failed as predicted. So let's look at the error message. And again, it's looking for that build spec file. So we'll need to add this to our source repository. So let's go over to our source code and clear.